morning. I'm Lincoln Walker, and this is the impact of industrialization on urban populations. Shown here is a decrepit, abandoned American landscape. Many Americans are no stranger to this kind of view and see this every single day. This rundown, either construction or just abandoned places. This is because of the mass migration of people away from urban areas, but also over-industrialization of urban areas. All of this land was once developed and produced and lived in, but not for long, which goes to show how the value of our urban land has lowered over time. I researched the extent to which industrialization of urban areas impacted the population of those areas in 20th century United States, looking specifically on public health and personal financial impact. What I found was that the industrialization of urban areas in 20th century United States lowered overall public health and decreased the financial stability of the people living in those urban areas. To begin with, we have public health. As we can see from this graph from the U.S. Center for Disease Control, the crude death rate for infectious diseases over the course of the 20th century, it is lowering. However, this is because of big improvements to public health because of the CDC themselves. But we do see spikes here, mainly from the influence of pandemic in the late 1910s. This goes to show the spread of disease from wastewater in urban areas because oftentimes short-term economic development and growth was prioritized more so than long-term environmental stability, even when in the long term it would have been economically viable to put those environmental practices in place. Another point on public health is that those living in urban areas were often over-dependent on manufactured foods. This, as we see in our society today a lot, has a negative impact on people's personal and physical health, as well as all types of health, being dependent on manufactured foods. What this also does is it ties the health of the population to food prices and the economy, because the populations of urban areas are not growing their own food and they don't have access to necessarily stable food supply. Price hikes can completely price them out of food entirely, which affects their health. And that ties me into my next point, the financial stability of those living in urban areas and how it's affected by over-industrialization. As we can see from this graph from the Social Science Research Journal, those in the agricultural field, as shown by the percentage of the workforce between 1880 and 1920, almost halved. So only half as many people were working in agriculture, which means that all of those people are now dependent on manufactured foods and thus the economy. We also see massive increases in the mining, construction, manufacturing, utilities, and producer services workforce, which is a sign of the industrialization that is currently going on in this time frame in urban areas. And that's to say, in 1880, the United States is already an industrial society, but this shows the massive growth away and shift away from agriculture into these industrial fields. So that is to say, the great job influx creates a wave of immigration. So the increased demand for industrial jobs decreases the job quality and wages and stability. Now, you would think that an increase in these fields would better the wages, increase the stability with these new markets and these new jobs opening up. But what happens is this massive boom in the number of jobs is not necessarily controlled, and thus the massive amount of immigration that comes in ends up lowering the wages and stability mainly lowering the stability of these jobs because of the massive amount of new workers. Now, it could be argued that the industrialization of urban areas did positively impact the people in those areas. Wages did double between 1940 and 1980, as shown from this graph from the Russell Sage Foundation Journal. Rent premiums did drop significantly, so it cost less for people to live in these urban areas over time. And it is often argued that unskilled laborers did not interfere with the skilled job market. However, as I showed before in the finance slide, urban wages are not necessarily correlated to job stability. While urban wages did increase between 1940 and 1980, as shown by this graph from the Federal Reserve Bank, the unemployment rate over the course of the 20th century, all of these bars here, these vertical bars, are all major recessions. And we see the unemployment rate continuing to be unstable, especially around the Great Depression, which shows that while urban wages may have risen, it didn't necessarily impact the overall financial stability of the population in those urban areas because the jobs were not often held on to for long. Joanne Norberg from Reason Magazine, one of the provided stimulus, states that in 1952, 1/10 of all U.S. employment was concentrated in the city of Detroit. And impressive hourly wages don't account for a lot if the jobs are not stable. And Detroit being a major manufacturing city in the 20th century, having such a high unemployment rate is indicative of the unstable job market in Detroit during that time. Ties right back into immigration filled existing jobs, didn't create new ones, so the industrialization did not, immigration did not cause the industrialization and create the jobs, but rather filled in existing jobs that locals would have had access to otherwise, and when they did have those jobs, it only decreased their quality and stability, putting pressure on the existing job market. Thank you.
All right, 2 questions for you. Again, first up, how valid and reliable were the sources that you used, and then how do you know they were?
I know that my sources were reliable because every source that I used, both in my paper and in the presentation, are all either peer-reviewed academic journals or straight from government sources. So I use sources from the CDC, from the National Institute of Health, and also Social Science Research Journal. So all peer-reviewed academic journals or straight from government sources.
Okay, and what additional questions popped up as you were working your way through your research?
A major question that popped up that I wasn't necessarily able to touch on, but would be worth looking into, is the effect on wildlife and the environment, which is part of what I touched on, but more of the human effect, looking on wildlife, the effect of wildlife and the land long term as a effect of the over-industrialization, which you can also very much see in my opening picture from Steph Lawless, the decrepit landscape. That's certainly something you could look into, and a question that popped up.